Good morning, everybody. I'm here with Professor Ilan Kelman, Professor of Disaster and Health at University College London in the UK and at the University of Agder in Norway. Nice to meet you, Ilan.
Thanks so much. Pleasure to be here, and thank you for all of your work.
And I'm here with my group mate, Kelly Mikelatou. Hi, Kelly.
Hi, David. It's nice to meet
Um,
you, Ilan.
Good to meet you.
in the previous episode, we were talking with Ilan about small island countries and the impact of climate change in these countries. One of the last questions that we had was regarding conflict and how conflict is possibly impacted by climate change. This is one of the most, let's say, common discourses within environmental security studies. And generally, this is often regarded as one of the conflict, one of the products of climate change. But is this really so, Ilan?
We've been looking at this for a long time, and a lot of my research is qualitative. I work with a lot of people who do very intensive quantitative studies also. And the baseline conclusion from both the qualitative, quantitative, and mixed studies is that we cannot link climate change to conflict. This covers both natural climate change and human-caused climate change. It also works at the collective or country sort of wide-scale level, and to some extent at the individual level, although there are a lot of nuances. Now, the real question is why? And particularly at the collective level, at the country level or international level, the reason is that people are in charge. There are leaders. There are groups manipulating those leaders. And conflict and peace come down to human decisions. So it's not like a leader wakes up and says, "Ooh, let's look at the thermometer. And yesterday it was 33 degrees Celsius. Today it's 34, so I'm going to start a war." I mean, that's just patently ridiculous. That doesn't happen. There are long-standing historical, cultural, social, societal, political reasons why leaders, groups, organizations, militaries, influencers of those groups and people will seek different forms of conflict or different forms of peace. Those are human decisions. And again, there are nuances, and if you want, we can go into the individual aspects, but at that level, at that collective level, at that international level, we really need to avoid trying to place the blame for war, conflict, violence on climate or environment, and instead recognize that people have power, people who influence those people have power, and they will choose it to pursue peace and conflict, cooperation, collaboration, and war based on their own interests and their own approaches, which can include ideologies, financial gain, desire for power, or simply pure hate from history and ideology.
One of, please, Kelly.
No, I just wanted to ask if it's actually climate change and extreme events are actually used as a scapegoat by bad leaders, especially in the MENA region.
So we do see that a lot, and it comes from different tracks. So you suggested leaders, and yeah, there are examples of leaders trying to use these situations to cause problems. The very sad example was after the 26th December 2004 tsunamis across the Indian Ocean, where the worst hit country was Indonesia, particularly in the conflict-ridden area of Aceh. But what happened is the leaders and among the different sides of that conflict were actually already seeking peace. And so they used the tsunami and the humanitarian operation, they used the disaster as one excuse among many to see peace. Whereas conversely, across the Indian Ocean and Sri Lanka, which was the second worst hit country, the various parties leading that conflict used the tsunami, the disaster, the humanitarian operation to continue the conflict pathway, which they wanted anyway. And so in the end, after another 4.5 years of absolutely brutal, horrific fighting, Sri Lanka's military won a victory in that. Tsunami is obviously not linked to climate change. So the question is whether or not we can then consider weather and climate change. And the same pattern emerges. So attributing specific disasters to climate change is incredibly difficult. But yes, leaders, media, non-governmental organizations, and others do frequently try and use it as an excuse, seeking climate change as a scapegoat for anything that happens. A lot of the work that we have done in what's called disaster diplomacy. So it's at disasterdiplomacy.org. We've papers, we've books, and that website, disasterdiplomacy.org, shows how much this scapegoating happens. And this can get into the specific examples. Shall we go into that? Do you want to discuss specific examples?
Yeah,
Yes,
sure.
please.
Yeah. So the big one is Syria. And a lot of the political leaders outside of that region, a lot of the media and even academic papers make a very simple linear link. They say, well, there was a huge drought, a really bad drought in Syria, sort of prior to 2011, prior to 2010. And they say that human-caused climate change led to that drought. That drought undermined food and water supplies, led to rural to urban migration, and then people reached the cities and started the revolution, which leads to the continuing violent conflict within Syria and the masses of people who have been forced to flee for their lives, part of the asylum seekers or refugees who are particularly coming to Europe. That's a very linear connection, and it breaks down at the first step, climate change to drought. What the science shows is that the drought in the years prior to the outbreak in the conflict around 2010, 2011, the science shows that that drought had perhaps twice the likelihood of happening due to human-caused climate change. There is no doubt of the strong possibility that us changing the climate influenced that drought. There is also no doubt that us changing the climate did not cause that drought. Because think of that phrasing, twice the likelihood of happening. That type of drought had a likelihood of happening in Syria anyway. And in fact, in the previous century in Syria, there had been perhaps up to half a dozen droughts of similar or greater magnitude than that drought prior to the outbreak of the conflict. So yes, droughts are extreme, but over the long term, they're not unusual. So this whole linear construct breaks down at that first step from climate change to drought. Then, drought undermining food and water supplies. Absolutely. The lack of rainfall, the precipitation deficit, caused problems. What also caused problems for food, water, agriculture in Syria is 2 generations of totalitarian dictators. The father-son team of Assad actually completely devastated water resources and agriculture across Syria. So when there was a major precipitation deficit, when there was a lack of rainfall, yes, many problems emerged. The other component to consider is that since the Assads took power in Syria up to the present day, Syria's population has perhaps gone up 4 times or 5 times, it's quadrupled or quintupled. To survive, people need water. The more people you have, the more water you use. So overall around the world, a good proportion of droughts come from water overuse and water mismanagement, irrespective of how much snow there is, when it melts, how it melts, irrespective of rainfall and rainfall variations. And so that pattern is absolutely evident within Syria. Increased population, increased water use, appalling leaders who undermine the water resources. So of course you get a bit less rainfall or a lot less rainfall, as happened in Syria, you get a major drought. Then it's fairly straightforward. That led to rural to urban migration and then obviously the uprising. But if you were ruled for 2 or 3 generations by a terrible leader, wouldn't you be using any excuse available to pick up a weapon and try and overthrow that ruler? There is this background. There are these long-term political processes, which then ultimately led to the terrible situation we see today. And of course, in order to start a revolution and to oppose a revolution, people need weapons. Arms traders, arms dealers from around the world, governments who are perfectly willing to supply arms to a violent conflict. That is all part of it. So the links from climate change to the terrible situation in Syria at the moment break down at that first step in terms of drought, but then there are all the other layers within the other steps which show that human-caused climate change, if it was an influence, it was a minor influence.
This made me think about the United Nations. In many reports of the United Nations, climate change is often quoted as one of the main, let's say, sources of conflict, and how this understanding, erroneous understanding from what you're saying, how does it impact UN action? Does it hinder the effectiveness of UN actions and resolutions?
Well, we don't have peace in Syria. And what we find through disaster diplomacy is a failure to admit the baseline fundamental root causes of conflict leads to a failure to solve that conflict. You're also absolutely right, Davide, to raise the issue of the UN. So another example is actually the genocide in Darfur in Sudan, which started in 2003. And the Secretary General of the United Nations at the time, Ban Ki-moon, claimed that that conflict, that genocide was, quote, arising at least in part from climate change, end quote. So scientists looked at it, and what they found is that the conflict was multifaceted. It was actually really about intertwined, deep-rooted issues encompassing livelihoods, ethnicities, land rights, corruption, inequitable resource distribution, basically history and hate. And note that it wasn't about resource scarcity or resource abundance. It was about inequitable resource distribution. So we do get these narratives. We do get these storylines, which then take over discourses described by the top diplomats, such as UN Secretary General, and then people start quoting it and they just assume it to be the truth, even when the subtleties are in the science and they're from anyone who knows the region. And climate change, exactly as you described, Kelly, climate change becomes that scapegoat.
Yeah. But also from the UN, a lot of leaders do not allow this humanitarian aid to come into the country. And especially in Sudan, they were also using black wells for water supply instead of using the UN. Why we still let that happen? How can the UN still let that happen?
What power does the UN actually have?
Yeah, that's very true.
This is actually a perpetual debate within humanitarianism, and it goes back centuries. It started with the modern conflict when Biafra in Nigeria tried to separate, and there was a terrible war and starvation in 1967, 1968. There was quite a struggle to get humanitarian aid in there. And as part of sort of the founding of contemporary humanitarianism, a lot of individuals said, we're going to go against all advice and against all authority and ensure that we get aid in there. Some of them then realized that the aid was actually prolonging and exacerbating the conflict. So the humanitarian aid was party to the difficulties experienced. That can absolutely be debated. Analyses continue today, despite it being decades ago, but that was a perception and the analysis of many people who were there in the operation. And so they went off and actually founded some major humanitarian organizations, ended up becoming renowned in the role of humanitarianism for suggesting that humanitarian aid should not be supplied. This continues to the present day. In 2008, a strong cyclone, Cyclone Nargis, went through Myanmar, Burma, and about 130,000 people were killed in the coastal areas. The military running the country at the time said that we actually don't need humanitarian aid. We don't want humanitarian aid, even though the need was obvious. So one of the ministers of France said, well, we'll just send in French warships and force humanitarian aid on the country. It didn't happen. It reinvigorated that debate where a certain party with power within a location denies humanitarian aid or even denies a need for humanitarian aid, do we have an obligation, duty, or right to use all means necessary, including military force, to deliver that aid? Untangling those ethics, not to mention the operational aspects, we just don't have answers. And this is very much a theme within disaster diplomacy. It's also a never-ending discussion within operational humanitarian people. The principle of do no harm. If you do not deliver aid because authorities decline it, are you doing more harm than using force in order to deliver that aid? And there are books written about this. And in Geneva, in New York, in academic and practitioner conferences, we debate this all the time because it's not clear. So where does climate change sit within this realm of how do we help people who through no fault of their own are dying from lack of food, shelter, and water?
Interesting. What do you think the current debate that you mentioned will need to better understand the loose connection between climate change and conflict? Do we perhaps need to include more hard scientists within the political debate, within international debate? Do we need to focus on particular myth busting? What would you recommend?
Well, absolutely all of that. I would just say all scientists are so-called hard scientists. We all do fundamental research, hoping to serve society, at least in this field. This does not obviate the need for blue sky thinking, what's called curiosity-driven research. We should never, ever denigrate purely conceptual or theoretical approaches, whether in mathematics or music. It may not be obvious what the outcome for humanity will be, but spending money and time and effort on knowledge is a lot better than spending time, money, and effort on weapons that kill people. So within this, it's all scientists being hard, all scientists being soft, or just drop those labels. As a scientist, as an academic, I'm definitely going to say much more evidence-based decision-making. I would prefer much less ideology. I would prefer much less hate, much less conflict, much less violence, much more open discussion, even if we agree. Sorry, even if we disagree. And it's not about agreeing to disagree, it's what's called disagreeing well. Recognizing that we have different perspectives, different backgrounds, different interests. We can still disagree while looking through the evidence, analyzing why, where, and how we disagree, and potentially even coming to an appropriate decision or action pathway while disagreeing. So again, as a scientist, as an academic, I'm going to argue not necessarily for scientists or academics in position of power, but absolutely much more authority, much more listening to those who have the evidence and recognizing the limitations in the evidence and the uncertainties. And one example is the individual level. So if we talk about human-caused climate change leading to violence or conflict, we know that air temperature and humidity are increasing because of human-caused climate change. We see it everywhere, and we can attribute heat wave deaths. We can attribute heat wave deaths to human-caused climate change. Heat changes our bodies. It stresses us physically, which augments mental stress and possibly mental health and well-being concerns. People who have mental health illnesses, heat and humidity can exacerbate them, such as schizophrenia and dementia. Many people who have mental health illnesses are perfectly able to function through medication. The hotter the air temperature, the less effective some medications are. So there could be, at the individual level, a direct link: human-caused climate change, worse heat and humidity, changing mental health. In the instances where the mental health concerns perpetuate, support, or exacerbate violence, and it's not all of them, but it does happen, then maybe we see increased individual violence. Is a possibility being explored? We need a lot more evidence. We need to ensure we are not perpetuating any myths and absolutely not stigmatizing people who do use medication, who do have these mental health illnesses, these mental health concerns. So that's a perfect example where at the individual level, we may need to be concerned about individual violence possibly linked back to human-caused climate change, and therefore intervene in order to stop it. The other side of the evidence is that in no way does the evidence show, and no way would I support someone who says, well, yeah, you know what, I robbed that person in a heat wave, but it was climate change. Or someone who says, oh yeah, they killed their spouse, but it was hot that night, so that's okay. Again, that's just as ridiculous as blaming a couple of degrees Celsius on the reason for starting a war. We have social norms, we have social expectations. There is no reason to perpetuate individual violence. And that's why we have both medical and judicial systems to deal with people who do, and particularly taking preventative approaches in order to avoid it. So even if we can make those individual links from human-caused climate change through to particular violence, that does not mean that any crime should be blamed on climate change. It is up to us to ensure that we have a society where people are free from all forms of violences.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the concept of authorities during this question. And I wanted to ask you, what happens when one of the biggest leaders denies the existence of climate change? We had Donald Trump do that, and there are many others who do it as well. What happens then?
That's not an evidence basis. There's two layers. I'd go back to saying I really would hope that those with power, political, corporate, nonprofit, I really would hope that they take on board science, research, and evidence far, far more than they do. The other level, though, is democracy. Any governance system is flawed. There is the quotation attributed to Winston Churchill that democracy is a worse form of government apart from all the others. So we know that there are powers, there are authorities in the shadows controlling aspects of our election and how elections and how we vote. That does not stop the fact that we still live in free democratic countries. We're fortunate to do so. You know, we're having this discussion, and I'm not going to be afraid that someone's going to knock at my door. Oh, never mind. I'm not afraid that someone's going to knock at my door and arrest me and torture me or execute me without trial. So we do have that level of democracy and freedom. And however flawed the US electoral system is, Donald J. Trump was elected with a Democratic mandate. I'm not obviously supporting his election. We know that so much money goes into US elections. We also know that the electoral college system does undermine democracy, but that is a system. There are ways to change it, and thus far, those who have the power to change it, it serves them, so they haven't changed it. Irrespective, there was a modicum of a free, fair, democratic election, and an ideological leader ended up in power against human-caused climate change. Other countries are not immune. Canada had a prime minister, Stephen Harper, who was not particularly in favor of accepting or dealing with human-caused climate change. And the possible prime minister in waiting in Canada as we speak in March 2024 may be similar. So that's what happens. It's up to us. But yes, if I'm asked, of course I want more science research and evidence to be within our governing systems, both elected and non-elected.
Thank you very much for all of your insights, Ilan. That was amazing. Unfortunately, we don't have much time left for our podcast, but we can, of course, resume another time. David, do you have any last questions you want to ask? We have 10 minutes.
Perhaps we could just make a short summary for the viewer. So we talked about climate change and conflict and its relation, how actually little evidence points to the direct correlation between the two. Am I right, Ilan?
Yes, absolutely. And I've taught qualitatively, but there are numerous quantitative studies which try to find correlations and generally fail. Even where there are quantitative correlations, correlation is not necessarily causation. So when we drill down deeply and say, well, why is that correlation happening? It's often spurious, or there may be other reasons which are not linked to human-caused climate change.
We have further brought forward two examples of Syria and Sudan, and we have discussed how the UN, by accepting this discourse on climate change and conflict, actually hinders its action. It was a very interesting debate. Thank you, Ilan. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks to both of you for having this conversation.
And here on my side, it's everything.
Yeah, it was very insightful. Thank you again.
And I'd be delighted to be in touch with anyone who's listening, watching. You can find me on social media. I'm on email, and let's continue these conversations because evidence changes, and we have to change our ideas with what the evidence tells us.
Of course, for all of you watching, you can find Ilan in the description of our video, which will be uploaded in the ITSS member series channel. And thank you very much all for watching.
Thank you.
Bye.